They say the higher you climb, the harder you fall. For Amara Williams, waking up in a Hanamdong UN village penthouse didn't feel like a climb at all. It felt like an abduction. The storm that had raged over Seoul all night had finally exhausted itself. It left behind a sky the color of a healing bruise, purple and swollen along the horizon, and a city that glittered faintly under a film of receding rain. Down below, the Han River sulked its way between glass and concrete, stirred by the last stubborn gusts of wind. But up here, above the restless traffic and early morning deliveries, the world felt unnaturally still. Inside the penthouse, the silence had weight. It sat in the corners, pressed into the expensive furniture, and hummed beneath the polished marble floors. No pipes rattled, no neighbors argued through thin walls, no street vendors shouted for attention. The air was temperature-controlled, filtered, perfected. It had that faintly chemical cleanness that came from machines, not windows, and underneath that ran a subtle, familiar note of cologne that made Amara's throat tighten. She sat rigid on the edge of the guest bed, fingers curled in the edge of a duvet that was too soft, too heavy, too foreign. The fabric pooled around her like spilled cream, swallowing the wrinkles made by her restless shifting. She had tried to lie down. She had tried to close her eyes. None of it had worked. Her body was exhausted, but her nerves refused to stand down. Every time she let her eyelids droop, the night replayed in jump cuts. The beep of her apartment door unlocking without a key, the flash of dark umbrellas outside on the street, the gleam of black SUVs lined up like a threat, the way the leather of the back seat had stuck to her rain-soaked clothes as Seoul blurred past the tinted windows. The neon glare of Itaewon had given way to quieter, richer teen streets, then to the guarded calm of the hilltop where UN Village perched like a private kingdom. She had crossed a threshold last night, and now every cell in her body knew it. The guest room was beautiful in that perfectly curated, impersonal way rich people's spare spaces often were. Neutral tones dominated everything, soft grays, warm whites, brushed gold. An abstract painting hung over the bed, all sweeping lines and muted colors that said nothing and cost too much. The lamps on the nightstands cast a gentle, diffused glow that erased shadows instead of deepening them. There were no family photos, no childhood mementos, no clutter. Nothing that proved people actually lived here. Nothing except the crib. It sat in one corner of the room, close enough that she could reach it in 3 steps, far enough that she had paced the space between bed and crib a dozen times, wearing an invisible track into the plush rug. The crib was white and sleek, the kind of minimalist design that made its price tag invisible but enormous. The mobile hanging above it looked handmade, each little cloud and star cut from soft felt, suspended on thin strings that swayed almost imperceptibly in the air conditioning. Leo lay there, small and utterly unaware of the fault line running through the morning. He sprawled on his back, chubby legs slightly bent, one arm thrown above his head in a pose of careless trust. His lashes rested like tiny fans against his cheeks. Every so often, his mouth would twitch, a hint of a smile or a protest passing through whatever dreamland toddlers visited. His favorite lion print blanket was bunched around his waist, its once bright colors faded from too many washes in cheap apartment machines. Amara rose from the bed and crossed to him, bare feet sinking into the thick rug. The silence pressed closer with every step, as if the room were holding its breath with her. She leaned over the crib, the loose t-shirt she'd fallen asleep in hanging, straight from her shoulders, and placed a trembling hand on Leo's back. There it was, the steady, rhythmic rise and fall. A small, solid heartbeat against her palm, the simple, continuous miracle of his breathing. The knot in her chest loosened, just a fraction. If she focused only on this, on the warmth under her fingertips, on the quiet snuffle as he exhaled. She could almost pretend they were still in their cramped Itaewon apartment, where the ceiling cracked in one corner and the neighbor's television bled through the wall every night. In that world, there were no marble floors, no private elevators, no men in suits waiting on the street. In that world, Leo's father was a ghost she kept locked in old memories, not a living, breathing force moving somewhere beyond a door she couldn't lock. Her gaze drifted to that door now. It was heavy and seamless, its hinges hidden, its frame flush with the wall. There was no keyhole on this side, no chain to slide across, no simple, metal twist she could turn to keep anyone out. It was a small detail, one she might have missed in another life. In this life, it glowed at her like a warning sign. He had thought of that, or someone had, on his behalf. Either way, the message was clear. Privacy in this house was a courtesy, not a right. She let her hand rest on Leo's back a moment longer, drawing strength from the warmth there, then straightened. The room seemed to grow taller as she pulled herself upright, the ceiling stretching higher, the walls leaning in. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, its screen a cold rectangle in her hand. 6:58 a.m., 2 minutes to 7. She had no appointments to meet, no commute to rush for, no nanny agency to text. But there was a schedule nonetheless, and her entire body had aligned itself to it. She didn't know what time he had slept, if he'd slept at all. She only knew that 7 o'clock felt like something, a threshold, an hour when decisions were made and orders were given, when markets opened and lives changed. She knew he would come, not because they had spoken, not because anyone had announced it. She knew in the same way she used to know when he was about to knock on her door, back when everything was simpler and infinitely more complicated. The air would shift, her pulse would trip, some invisible line between them tightening. It was tightening now. This house was too expensive for squeaky wood or rattling pipes. It had been built to keep noise out, not in. But money couldn't silence instinct. The silence around her deepened, as if the walls were listening too. Somewhere beyond the guest room, a pocket of air moved differently. Somewhere, a presence drew closer. Her fingers, still curled around the phone, began to shake. She forced herself to set it down carefully, quietly, as if noise alone could wake sleeping monsters. Her free hand hung uselessly at her side, flexing once, twice, like it wanted to reach for a weapon she didn't have. On the other side of the door, a shadow passed. The handle turned with a slow, deliberate motion, the polished metal catching a flash of muted morning light. The mechanism inside shifted with a heavy, final click that rolled across her nerves like thunder after lightning. Amara's breath caught in her throat. Every particle of air in the room seemed to freeze. The soft hum of the air conditioning receded to a distant whisper. Even Leo's gentle breathing sounded louder suddenly, a fragile metronome keeping time in a moment that wanted to last forever and be over at once. The door opened. He filled the doorway easily, broad shoulders framed by the sleek lines of the hallway behind him. For a heartbeat, all Amara saw was the silhouette, a dark shape against pale light, a ghost from a life she had spent 2 years outrunning. Then he stepped fully into the room, and the ghost became a man again. Kang Minjun walked in, and the world she had built on lies and distance shuddered. He didn't look like the CEO of K-Tech Industries this morning. The man who commanded boardrooms and signed contracts worth billions had been stripped down to something more raw, more human. His white dress shirt was wrinkled, the fabric creased at the elbows where he'd rolled the sleeves to his forearms. The top 3 buttons were undone, exposing the hollow at the base of his throat, and a line of collarbone that Amara's eyes caught on before she could stop herself. His tie was gone entirely, discarded somewhere in the night, probably strangled between frustrated fists. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. red-rimmed, sleepless, haunted by something she couldn't quite name. Rage, grief, betrayal, all three bleeding together until they became indistinguishable. He looked like a man who had spent the last 3 hours staring into an abyss that had finally stared back. He didn't offer pleasantries. No good morning, no polite inquiry about her rest, no acknowledgement of the bizarre intimacy of walking into her bedroom at dawn. His footsteps were heavy on the marble floor, each one deliberate, measured, the sound of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed from it. He crossed the room in 5 strides and stopped at the nightstand. Then, with a movement so sharp it made Amara flinch, he dropped a single sheet of paper onto the polished wood surface. Slap. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. The paper landed face up. Even from where she stood, Amara could see the logo at the top. Seoul National University Hospital, Department of Genetic Testing. Bold red letters stamped diagonally across the page screamed a single word. Confirmed. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, gravel dragged across broken glass. Read it. It wasn't a request. It was barely even a command. It was something darker, heavier, vibrating with the force of emotions he was barely holding in check. Amara didn't move. She couldn't. Her muscles had locked the moment the paper hit the table, some primal part of her brain recognizing a threat even if she couldn't articulate what kind. That paper is a bullet, and he just loaded the gun. She kept her eyes on him instead of the document, watching the tension coil in his forearms, the way his jaw worked as he ground his teeth together. If she didn't look at the paper, maybe it wasn't real yet. Maybe reality could stagger along in its current broken state for just a few more seconds. Minjun, she started, her voice hoarse from disuse and fear. I said read it. The words sliced through the air. Behind her, Leo stirred in the crib. The baby let out a tiny sigh. Barely a sound, more of a shift in breathing, but it was enough. Minjun flinched as if he'd been struck. The anger on his face cracked, splintered, then forced itself into a smaller shape. His shoulders tensed, then deliberately eased. His hands, which had been clenched into fists at his sides, slowly opened. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying than the shout had been. I had the lab run a rush analysis on the saliva from the pacifier, he said, each word precisely enunciated, as if he'd practiced this speech in the mirror and refused to deviate from the script. The one he dropped in my car last night when you tried to tell me he wasn't mine. He paused, letting that sink in. The implication that he'd been collecting evidence while she'd been trying to hold her lie together. I woke up the head of the genetics department at Seoul National Hospital at 4 a.m, Minjun continued. His eyes never left her face, tracking every micro-expression, every tell. I had him personally oversee the processing. I wanted results before you could run again. He leaned forward slightly, one hand braced on the nightstand, the other pointing at the paper with a finger that trembled. Just barely, but she saw it. Paternity index, he said, voice dropping even lower, 99.9%. That's not a coincidence, Amara. That's not a nanny job. That's not some other man's child you happen to be caring for. He tapped the paper twice, the sound sharp and final. That is my blood, my DNA, my son. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation and a revelation all at once. Amara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Of course he'd done the test. She should have expected it the moment he saw Leo's face, the moment he noticed the birthmark. Men like Kang Min-jun didn't operate on faith or hope. They operated on data, on proof, on evidence that could be presented in a boardroom or a courtroom. But expecting it and confronting it were two different things. She forced her legs to move, one foot in front of the other until she stood beside the nightstand. Her hand shook as she reached for the paper, fingers closing around the edge. The document felt heavier than it should, as if the weight of truth had physical mass. The technical language blurred for a moment. Genetic markers, allele frequencies, probability calculations that meant nothing to her untrained eye. But then her gaze locked on the summary box at the bottom, the place where all the science condensed into a single, undeniable conclusion. Alleged father: Kang Minjun child. Patient B, male, 18 months. Paternity: probability, 99.9% conclusion. Inclusion: the alleged father cannot be excluded as the biological father of the child. The paper trembled between her fingers. She had known, of course. From the moment she'd seen the positive pregnancy test, from the first ultrasound where the technician had remarked on the baby's strong profile, from Leo's first breath when she'd counted his fingers and seen the birthmark already forming on his neck. She had known whose son he was, but knowing in her heart and seeing it stamped in red ink by a hospital laboratory were catastrophically different things. Behind her, Minjun moved. She sensed rather than saw him cross to the floor-to-ceiling windows, putting distance between them. Or maybe putting distance between himself and the crib, as if proximity to his son might shatter whatever fragile control he was maintaining. "You stood in that hallway last night," he said, his back to her now, silhouette stark against the gray morning light. "You looked me in the eye, and you said, 'He's not yours.'" His reflection in the glass showed his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the way his hands had found his pockets as if to keep them from doing something he'd regret. "You lied to my face," he continued, voice barely controlled. "You held my son in your arms and told me he belonged to someone else. You let me believe—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "You let me believe I was losing my mind," he finished quietly. "That I was seeing connections that weren't there because I wanted them to be there. Because I was desperate." Guilt burned through Amara's chest, sharp and hot and unbearable. She had rehearsed that lie for 2 years. She had practiced it in mirrors, in the shower, in the middle of sleepless nights when fear kept her staring at the ceiling. She had built an entire identity around it. Not Leo's mother, just a nanny. Not Minjun's lover, just a woman who happened to have a child. The lie had kept them safe, but it had also kept them trapped. "I lied to keep him alive," she shot back, the words ripping from her throat before she could soften them, before she could make them more palatable. Minjun turned from the window, eyebrows drawing together in an expression that was equal parts confusion and offense. "Alive?" His voice rose, then immediately dropped again when Leo shifted in the crib. He caught himself, shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining control. "Do you think I'm a monster, Amara? Do you actually believe I would hurt my own son?" The word son hung between them. No longer the baby, or that child, or any of the careful distancing language people used when they weren't sure. Son, claimed, acknowledged, real. Amara set the DNA test back on the nightstand, her fingers leaving slight impressions on the paper. "No," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "I don't think you would hurt him." She lifted her chin, finding strength somewhere in the exhausted corners of her soul. "I knew your family would." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Minjun's entire body went still. Not the stillness of calm, but the frozen paralysis of someone who had just had their world inverted. His expression cycled through confusion, denial, and something that looked dangerously close to dread. "Don't," he started, voice tight. "Don't talk to me about my family. You don't know—" "I know exactly what your family is capable of," Amara interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. 2 years of fear and exhaustion had built a pressure inside her chest, and now that the dam had cracked, everything came flooding out. "My mother showed me the bank records, Amara. She showed me the transfer. 50. million. 1. He enunciated each word like he was presenting evidence in a trial, which in a way, he was. She told me you came to her, Minjun continued, his voice gaining strength as he fell back on the story he'd been fed, the narrative he'd clung to for 2 years to make sense of his abandonment. That you asked for a payoff? That you negotiated the price? She showed me the withdrawal slip with your signature, or what looked like your signature. His laugh was bitter, sharp enough to cut. I defended you, he said. I told her you weren't like that. I said you loved me, that we had plans, that you wouldn't just disappear for money. And then she showed me the account number in the Cayman Islands where the money had been transferred. She showed me flight manifests with your name on them. He took a step toward her and Amara saw the hurt man underneath the CEO facade, the man who had been betrayed, or thought he had been, and had spent 2 years hardening around that wound. You sold us, he said, voice cracking on the last word. You sold me. For 50 million won and a clean exit. Amara stood up straight, exhaustion falling away as anger flooded her veins, clean, clarifying, hot. I never signed anything, she said, each word sharp and clear as breaking ice. I never took a dime. Then explain why you left. Minjun's voice rose again, then caught. He glanced at Leo, who was stirring now, little hands curling and uncurling in the beginnings of wakefulness. Explain why I came back from New York to an empty apartment. No note. No call. Just gone. His hands spread wide, helpless. You were my entire world, Amara, he said quietly, and you vanished like I'd imagined you. The grief in his voice almost broke her. Almost made her reach for him, comfort him, apologize for pain she hadn't meant to cause. But then she remembered. She had tried to reach him. She had tried to explain. And the walls his mother had built had been too high, too thick. Because she came to me, Amara said. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Minjun went very still. What do you mean? She came to you. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, dragging the memory up from the place where she'd buried it, deep, where it couldn't hurt her every day, where it only surfaced in nightmares. She didn't come to the apartment, Amara said, opening her eyes. The memory was playing behind her retinas now, unavoidable. She doesn't step into places like that. She summoned me to the Shilla Hotel. Room 204. I remember because I stared at the plaque outside the door for 5 full minutes before I could make myself turn the handle. The hotel room expanded to fill the space between them. The smell of overbrewed tea from a silver service cart, the scratch of expensive upholstery, the weight of afternoon light filtered through floor-to-ceiling curtains that cost more than Amara's monthly salary. I walked in, she continued, her voice distant now, narrating the memory rather than living it. And she was sitting in an armchair by the window, drinking tea from a porcelain cup with gold trim, like it was just another business meeting, just another Tuesday. Amara's hands curled into fists at her sides. She didn't offer me a seat, she said. She didn't even take off her coat, this cream Burberry trench that probably cost more than my year's tuition. She just gestured to the folder on the coffee table and said, I believe we have something to discuss. Minjun's face had gone pale. His jaw was so tight Amara could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. She had a folder, Amara continued, the words coming faster now, like poison she needed to purge. A perfectly neat manila folder, the kind you'd use for quarterly reports or contract negotiations. She opened it like she was revealing revenue projections, and then she pulled out photographs. Her voice caught, and she had to force the next words out. Not of us, she said. Not of you and me together. No evidence of our relationship, of my parents, in Atlanta. Minjun's breath left him in a rush, like he'd been punched. One photo, Amara said, her eyes fixed on his face watching him process this, was of my dad standing outside Greater Hope Baptist Church. He was holding his Bible, wearing his Sunday suit, the navy one he'd had for 20 years because pastors at small churches don't make enough to buy new ones often. He was smiling at someone off camera, probably Sister Margaret, who always brought him coffee. Her voice hardened. Another was my mom at Grady Memorial Hospital, she continued. In her scrubs, her name badge clearly visible, Patricia Williams, RN. She looked exhausted. That end of double shift exhaustion where you can barely remember your own name. But she was smiling too because that's what my mom does. She smiles through everything. Amara took a step toward him, closing the distance, needing him to see her face, to understand the weight of what his mother had done. Your mother flipped through them like a portfolio, she said. Like she was showing me investment properties. She said, Pastor James Williams, Nurse Patricia Williams, very respectable careers, very respectable people. Then she looked up at me, and her face was completely calm, empty. And she said, It would be such a shame if something unfortunate happened to their records. Minjun's hands had come out of his pockets. They hung at his sides, trembling slightly. She told me, Amara continued, relentless now, needing him to hear all of it, that if I didn't disappear, if I didn't take the ticket she'd prepared and leave Seoul immediately, my father's pension could be revoked due to an administrative error, that my mother could lose her nursing license over a documentation discrepancy. She laughed, a sound with no humor in it. She said she had people who owed her favors, Amara said. In Atlanta. People who could make problems appear in my parents' lives. Small problems at first. Audits, investigations, paperwork that went missing. Then bigger problems. Accidents happen, she said, especially to people who don't have the resources to protect themselves. The hotel room was gone now, but the echo of Madame Kang's voice remained, cultured, calm, utterly devoid of mercy. She told me, Amara said, her own voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. You and my son have had your fun. But this ends now. A mixed-race heir will tank the stock price. Our partners will panic. Our competitors will feast on the scandal. I will not allow a mistake to destroy what 3 generations of Kangs have built. She watched Minjun's face as the word registered. Mistake. His mother had called their unborn child a mistake before he'd even existed, before his heart had started beating, before he'd taken his first breath. She called Leo a mistake, Amara said, making sure he understood. Before he was born, before I was even showing. She looked at me, at us, at what we could have been, and called it a mistake that needed to be erased. Minjun sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, as if his legs had simply given out. The mattress dipped under his weight. He put his head in his hands, fingers digging into his hair. She slid an envelope across the table, Amara continued, her momentum carrying her forward now. Inside was a plane ticket to London, business class, leaving that night. A cashier's check for 50 million won made out to cash, so there'd be no paper trail, and a non-disclosure agreement that would have legally prevented me from ever telling you I'd been pregnant. She crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture, protecting the heart that still hurt when she thought about that afternoon. And then she gave me a choice, Amara said. Take the ticket and leave quietly, and she'd make sure the check cleared, and my parents never had any unfortunate problems. Or stay and watch her systematically destroy everything I loved. Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated herself for it, for showing weakness, for letting him see how much it had cost her. She said, If you're still in Seoul tomorrow, I'll assume you've chosen the hard way. And I promise you, Miss Williams, you don't want to see what the hard way looks like. The silence that followed was absolute. Minjun sat motionless, head still in his hands, shoulders rising and falling with breaths, that looked painful. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. Not from lack of sleep now, but from something deeper. "I didn't choose money, Minjun," Amara said, her voice steady again, stronger now that the poison was out. "I chose survival. I chose to protect my parents from a woman who threatened them, because they had the misfortune of raising a daughter you loved. And I chose to keep our son away from a grandmother who wanted him erased from existence." She walked over to him, standing close enough that he had to look up to meet her eyes. "So yes," she said, "I lied to you last night. I lied to keep Leo alive, because I knew that if your mother found out he existed, she'd find a way to take him. Or worse." For a long moment Minjun didn't speak. Then his knees seemed to give out and he sat heavily on the edge of the bed, elbows on his thighs, head bowed. The man who walked into Mergers without blinking suddenly looked hollowed out, as if someone had ripped the floor out from under his entire childhood. The loyalty he had wrapped around his mother like armor felt for the first time, like a knife pointed in the wrong direction. Pause, and sit with that for a second. Imagine finding out your own mother didn't just lie to you. She exiled the woman you loved and your unborn son. If you were in Minjun's place right now, what would you do? Grab your child and run, or stay and fight the family from the inside? Tell me in the comments. Type "run" if you'd disappear with Leo, or "fight" if you'd stay and go to war at that brunch. Minjun stared at her for a long moment, and she watched the truth settle over him like a weight he'd been carrying his whole life without realizing it. He had always known his mother was ruthless. He'd watched her gut competitors without blinking, seen the way she could reduce grown men to stammering apologies with a single cutting remark. He knew she built the Kang Empire with calculated risk and controlled fear. But this wasn't just ruthless. This wasn't business strategy or competitive advantage. This was surgical cruelty, aimed at people who had nothing to do with their world. People whose only crime was loving someone the matriarch deemed inappropriate. "I need to sit down," Minjun said faintly, though he was already sitting. "You are sitting," Amara pointed out. "Then I need to lie down," he said. "Or drink, or—" He stopped, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. "My mother did that. My mother threatened your family." It wasn't a question, but Amara answered anyway. "Yes." "My mother," he repeated as if saying it multiple times would make it make sense. "The woman who made me seaweed soup for my birthday, who taught me to bow properly at ancestral rites, who cried at my university graduation." "The same woman," Amara confirmed quietly. Minjun let his hands fall, staring at nothing. "I thought you left for money," he said, voice hollow. "For 2 years I told myself you were just another person who saw an opportunity and took it. That I'd been stupid to trust you, stupid to believe we could work despite everything. I let myself hate you because it was easier than admitting I'd failed to protect you." He looked up at her, and there was anguish in his eyes that made Amara's chest ache. "I should have known," he said. "I should have questioned her story. I should have searched harder, pushed past the lies, found you before." He glanced at the crib, where Leo was now fully awake, staring at them with curious, dark eyes. "Before I missed 18 months of his life." "You didn't know," Amara said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Anger was easier than forgiveness, but standing here watching him break under the weight of his mother's betrayal, she found she didn't have the energy for anger anymore. She's good at what she does. She's had decades of practice manipulating situations to get what she wants. "That doesn't excuse it," Minjun said. "That doesn't excuse me believing her over you." "No," Amara agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in that truth for a moment, uncomfortable, raw, but necessary. Then Leo made a sound, a babbling, happy sound that cut through the heavy atmosphere like sunlight through storm. Clouds. Both adults turned to look at him. He was standing in the crib now, little hands gripping the rail, bouncing on his feet in that way toddlers do when they're excited about nothing and everything. "Mama," he said, his words slightly slurred but unmistakable. Then he looked at Minjun, this stranger who was in the room again, and pointed. "Man!" Despite everything, Amara felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. "Yes, baby. That's a man." "That's Appa," Minjun said quietly, the Korean word for father barely more than a whisper. "I'm your Appa." Leo considered this, head tilting. Then he held out his arms in the universal toddler signal for "pick me up" and said, "Up! Mama! Up!" Amara moved automatically, crossing to the crib, but Minjun stood faster. "Can I?" he asked, hesitant in a way she'd never seen him before. "Can I hold him?" She nodded, stepping back. Minjun approached the crib like it held something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. He reached in, hands hovering for a moment as if he wasn't sure how to proceed, then carefully, so carefully, lifted Leo out. The baby came easily, curious rather than frightened. He pressed one chubby hand against Minjun's cheek, exploring, then grabbed a fistful of his hair. "Ow!" Minjun said mildly, but he was smiling, a real smile, small and wondering, as he looked at his son for the first time without lies between them. "You have a strong grip." "He gets that from you," Amara said before she could stop herself. Minjun's eyes met hers over Leo's head, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not reconciliation, but the first fragile thread of understanding. "We need to talk about what happens next," Minjun said. "I know," Amara replied. "But first," he continued, bouncing Leo slightly when the baby started to squirm, "can you show me how to change a diaper? Because I think we have an immediate problem." Despite everything, despite the DNA test on the nightstand, despite the mother-in-law from hell, despite 2 years of pain and fear, Amara laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but real. "Come on," she said, leading him toward the attached bathroom where someone had helpfully stocked every possible baby necessity. Lesson 1 in being a father: always check for the warning signs. As she walked him through the mechanics of diaper changing, him fumbling with the tabs, Leo kicking and trying to grab everything, Amara providing running commentary, she realized something had shifted. They weren't okay. They were very far from okay. But for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't facing this alone. And for Minjun, for the first time in 2 years, he was facing the truth instead of his mother's carefully constructed lies. It was a start. 4 minutes. That's how long they had before Madame Kang's car would glide up to the private entrance, before the elevator would carry her to the penthouse, before the fragile piece of the morning shattered completely. Minjun's phone had buzzed while he was putting Leo's shoes on, a task that proved surprisingly difficult when the toddler kept pulling his feet back and giggling. And when he'd glanced at the security notification, every line of his body had gone tense. "She's here," he'd said. Now, Amara stood in the guest bedroom staring at the white box Minjun had thrust into her hands before striding out to prepare. The gold ribbon had dulled slightly with time, the edges of the cardboard were barely softened from 2 years of waiting, but the box itself was pristine. "I bought this 2 years ago," he'd said, his voice carefully neutral. "I was going to give it to you the night I proposed. I kept it. Torture, I guess." Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Cream silk spilled out like liquid light, the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle, that moved like water, that probably cost more than 3 months of her old rent. She lifted the dress out, a simple cut, deceptively so, because simplicity at this level of craftsmanship required expertise. V-neck, cap sleeves, a waistline that would hug without clinging, a hem that would float just above her knees. She held it up to herself in the full-length mirror and almost laughed at the absurdity. Her, in silk. Her, meeting the woman who had threatened her parents while wearing a dress that woman's son had bought for a proposal that never happened. I can't do this, she said to her reflection. Yes, you can, Mrs. Park said from the doorway, making Amara jump. The housekeeper had appeared like a ninja, holding a makeup bag and a hairbrush. You must. Madame Kang will be here in 3 minutes now. You need armor. It's just a dress, Amara protested weakly. No, Mrs. Park said, coming into the room with the confidence of someone who had been navigating Chaebol family politics for 2 decades. It is statement. It says, I belong here. I am not ashamed. I am not hiding. She set down the makeup bag and took the dress from Amara's hands. Put it on, Mrs. Park instructed. Quickly now, I will do your hair. Amara's fingers fumbled with the zipper of her jeans, her movements clumsy with adrenaline and lack of sleep. She stripped off her t-shirt, the cheap cotton one she'd been wearing since yesterday, and pulled the silk over her head. It slid on like a whisper, settling against her skin with an intimacy that felt almost obscene. The fit was perfect, because of course it was, because Minjun had measured her favorite sweater while she showered, because even 2 years ago he'd been planning a future she didn't know she wouldn't see. Mrs. Park zipped her up with practiced efficiency, then gently pushed Amara into the chair at the vanity. Close eyes, the housekeeper said, already wielding a brush against Amara's hair with swift, sure strokes. I will be fast. Amara closed her eyes and tried not to think about the fact that in 2 minutes, no, 1 minute and 30 seconds now, she would be standing in front of the woman who had threatened her family, the woman who had called Leo a mistake, the woman who had orchestrated 2 years of unnecessary suffering. Her hands started to shake again. Breathe, Mrs. Park said, still working. Minjun will not let her hurt you. How do you know? Amara asked, eyes still closed. Because I have seen the way he looks at you, Mrs. Park replied simply. And because I know what it means when a man like him keeps a dress in a box for 2 years. Men like that do not forget. They do not forgive themselves. And they do not make same mistake twice. She pulled Amara's hair back into a sleek bun, not casual, not messy, but deliberate and elegant. Open, Mrs. Park instructed. Amara opened her eyes. The woman in the mirror looked like someone else, someone who belonged in penthouses and press conferences, someone who could stand next to a Chaebol heir without looking, like an imposter. The dress transformed her from a struggling nanny into something that looked like an equal. Good, Mrs. Park said with satisfaction. Now remember, you have something she cannot take away. You have Leo. You have truth. She has only lies, and lies are heavy to carry. From the living room, they heard the elevator chime. Amara's heart slammed against her ribs. Time to go, Mrs. Park said, helping her up. Hold head high. You are Leo's mother. That makes you royalty in this family, whether she likes it or not. Amara walked out of the guest room on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The hallway opened into the massive living space, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture arranged in perfect, uninviting angles. Minjun stood in the center of the foyer holding Leo, his hand resting protectively on his son's back. When he saw her, something flickered across his face. Surprise, admiration, pain, all compressed into a single moment before his CEO mask slid back into place. You're beautiful, he said quietly. Don't, Amara replied, moving to stand beside him. Don't make this about that. I'm not, Minjun said. I'm making it about the fact that when she walks through that door, she's going to see that you're not going anywhere, that you're not afraid. I am afraid, Amara admitted. I know, Minjun said. Stay angry. It keeps you sharp. The elevator doors opened. The sound was soft, engineered to be pleasant. a gentle chime that wouldn't startle residents. But to Amara's ears, it was a bomb going off in slow motion. Madame Kang stepped out. She was exactly as Amara remembered. Tall and slender in that way that Korean women of a certain class cultivated through strict diet and expensive Pilates. Her hair was in a flawless French twist, not a strand out of place. She wore a Chanel suit, this one in navy with gold buttons, that probably cost more than Amara's student loans. Her makeup was subtle but perfect, highlighting her high cheekbones and sharp, intelligent eyes. She carried a handbag, one of those obscenely expensive ones that had waiting lists measured in years, and was digging through it as she stepped into the penthouse, her heels clicking with the precise rhythm of someone who expected the world to part for her. "Minjun," she said without looking up, her voice crisp and businesslike. "I checked the building access logs this morning. There was an unauthorized entry at 4 a.m. I assumed it was some girl you'd picked up at a club. You know how I feel about discretion." She pulled out a checkbook, leather-bound, monogrammed, and flipped it open with practiced ease. "I came to handle the NDA before this becomes a problem," Madame Kang continued, still not looking up. "How much does she want?" "They usually start at 10 million, but if she took photos or has messages, it could go as high as—" "Hello, Mother," Minjun said, his voice cutting through her monologue like a blade through silk. Something in his tone made her pause. She looked up. Her gaze landed first on her son, tall, composed, standing in his own foyer with the confidence of ownership. Then it slid to the side, catching on the woman in the cream dress. Recognition hit like lightning. Madame Kang's eyes widened, just fractionally, the only crack in her perfect composure. Her gaze traveled from Amara's face down to the dress, her son's dress, the dress he'd kept for 2 years, then back up again. "You," she said, the single word containing volumes of displeasure. Then her eyes dropped lower, landing on the bundle in Minjun's arms. "Leo." The checkbook fell from her hands. It hit the marble floor with a soft slap that echoed in the sudden silence. The leather cover fell open, revealing blank checks with the Kang family crest watermarked into expensive paper. Madame Kang's mouth opened slightly. Her hand, the one that had been holding the checkbook, stayed suspended in midair for a moment before dropping to her side. For the first time since Amara had met her, Madame Kang Soo-yeon looked completely, genuinely shocked. "Impossible," she whispered. Minjun shifted Leo to his other arm, the movement drawing attention to the child, to his dark, single-lidded eyes that were unmistakably Kang eyes, to the small hand gripping his father's collar, to the birthmark just visible on his neck above his shirt collar. "Put the checkbook away, Mother," Minjun said, his voice carrying that particular quality of calm that preceded storms. "You remember Amara. I believe you two met at the Shilla Hotel, room 204. Madame Kang's eyes snapped to his face, and for just a moment Amara saw fear flash through them. "And this," Minjun continued, reaching out to touch Leo's cheek with a tenderness that made Amara's throat tight, "is your grandson, Kang Leo, 18 months old, born while his mother was living in a one-room apartment in Itaewon because you threatened her family and made her believe she'd die if she stayed near me." The silence that followed was absolute. Madame Kang stumbled backward, her expensive heel catching slightly, and her hand shot out to grasp the elevator doorframe for support. The picture of perfect composure had shattered, leaving behind a woman who looked suddenly older, suddenly uncertain. "I have the DNA results on the table in the study," Minjun said, his voice never losing that dangerous calm. 99.9% match. Would you like to read them? Or would you prefer to explain to my fiancé—" He let the word hang in the air. "Why you threatened her parents' livelihoods and told her she'd disappear if she didn't leave Seoul?" Amara watched Madame Kang's face cycle through emotions faster than she could process them. Shock, denial, fury, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like fear. Minjun, Madame Kang started, her voice for once lacking its usual commanding tone. You don't understand what? I understand perfectly, Minjun interrupted. I understand that you saw the woman I loved as a threat to your power. I understand that you chose family reputation over my happiness and my son's existence. I understand that you're standing in my home, trying to buy off a problem that you created 2 years ago and thought you'd successfully eliminated. He took a step forward, and despite Leo in his arms, despite the domestic tableau, he looked every inch the CEO who could destroy careers with a phone call. What I don't understand, Minjun said, voice dropping even lower, is how you thought this would end any way other than badly for you. The elevator doors began to slide closed. Madame Kang jerked forward, stopping them with one hand, but she didn't leave. She stood in the threshold, caught between floors and decisions, while her carefully constructed world rearranged itself in ways she couldn't control. This isn't over, she said finally, but there was less conviction in her voice than Amara expected. You have no idea what you've done, what this will do to the family, to the company, to... I held a press conference this morning, Minjun said conversationally. Announced Leo's existence, created a foundation in his name, 100 billion won to support single mothers. The media response has been overwhelming positive. Shares are actually up. Madame Kang's face went pale under her perfect makeup. You wouldn't, she breathed. I already did, Minjun replied. An hour ago. It's trending on Naver right now. Would you like me to show you the articles? For a long moment, Madame Kang simply stared at her son. Then her gaze shifted to Amara, really looking at her for the first time. Not as an obstacle to be removed, but as a person who had just become a permanent fixture in her family. This conversation isn't finished, Madame Kang said, straightening her spine, rebuilding her armor. I will speak to your father. We will discuss this as a family. Father already knows, Minjun said. We met with him yesterday. He acknowledged Leo as his grandson. He supports my decision. Another blow. Amara watched it land, watched Madame Kang's perfect composure crack just a little more. We'll see about that, Madame Kang said, but the threat rang hollow. She stepped back into the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and kept her eyes on Minjun as the doors began to close. This isn't over, Minjun. You're my son. You'll realize your mistake soon enough. The doors sealed shut, cutting off whatever else she might have said. The silence that followed was deafening. Amara realized she'd been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, her entire body starting to shake as the adrenaline bled away. That was... she started. A disaster, Minjun finished. She'll be back. Probably with lawyers. She looked scared, Amara said, surprised at the observation. She was, Minjun replied, looking down at Leo, who had somehow fallen asleep during the entire confrontation, his cheek pressed against his father's shoulder. Because she's lost control. And for someone like my mother, loss of control is worse than losing money or face or power. He turned to look at Amara, and his expression softened. You were magnificent, he said. I barely said anything, Amara pointed out. You didn't have to, Minjun replied. You stood there in that dress, holding your head high, and showed her that you're not the terrified girl she sent away. You showed her she failed. Amara looked down at herself, at the cream silk that now felt less like armor and more like a promise. What happens now? She asked quietly. Minjun shifted Leo carefully, then reached out with his free hand and took hers. Now, he said, we wait for the next move. My mother won't surrender easily, but we have something she can't fight. The truth, my father's support, and public opinion on our side. He squeezed her hand, gently. "We're going to be okay, Amara," he said. "All three of us. I promise you." Amara wanted to believe him. Standing there in the morning light, her hand in his, their son sleeping peacefully between them, she almost did. But in the back of her mind, she could still see Madame Kang's face in that hotel room 2 years ago, cold, calculating, utterly convinced of her righteousness. And she knew this war was far from over. 6 months later, Seoul in autumn was a study in contradictions. The city held on to summer's heat during the day, tourists still shedding jackets in Insadong, businessmen loosening ties on the subway. But the nights brought a chill that promised winter wasn't far behind. The ginkgo trees along the Han River turned gold, carpeting the walking paths in yellow that looked painted on rather than grown. Amara pushed the stroller along the riverside trail, Leo pointing at every dog and bicycle and cloud with the enthusiasm only a 2-year-old could muster. He'd grown in the past months, taller, more verbal, his features sharpening into a face that would someday break hearts the way his father's did. "Dog," Leo announced, pointing at a particularly fluffy Jindo that was posing for photos with its owner. "Big dog, Mama." "Very big," Amara agreed, smiling at his excitement. In the early days, she'd tensed every time they went outside, expecting photographers or hostile strangers, or worse. But Seoul had absorbed the scandal of the CEO's secret heir with surprising grace. There had been articles, of course, some sympathetic, some less so, but the tide of public opinion had largely turned in their favor. The foundation had helped. 100 billion won was hard to argue with, especially when it started making tangible differences in single mothers' lives across Korea. Amara had even started working with it, lending her experience to program development, speaking at events about the realities of raising a child alone in a foreign country. It turned out being the face of a controversy made you visible in ways that could be leveraged for good. "Amara, see?" She turned to see Mireille jogging up the path, designer workout clothes and strategic ponytail suggesting she'd come from Pilates in Cheongdam-dong. Minjun's sister had become an unlikely ally, younger, less entrenched in family politics, and genuinely delighted to have a nephew. "Auntie!" Leo shrieked with joy, reaching for Mireille, who swept him up out of the stroller with practiced ease. "How's my favorite nephew?" Mireille cooed, then stage whispered to Amara. "Don't tell Jiwon I said that. She still thinks she's the favorite." "Your secret's safe with me," Amara promised, falling into step beside her as they walked. "Pilates?" "And avoidance," Mireille admitted cheerfully. "Mother's hosting tea for the Seoul Women's Association this afternoon. I developed a sudden scheduling conflict." The mention of Madame Kang still sent a small jolt of anxiety through Amara's system, though it was nothing compared to the paralytic fear of 6 months ago. True to Minjun's prediction, his mother hadn't surrendered easily. There had been lawyers, so many lawyers, and family meetings that turned into shouting matches, and one memorable incident where Madame Kang had tried to bribe Amara to sign custody away. That had been the final straw for Chairman Kang. He'd called an emergency board meeting, stripped his wife of several key positions, and made it clear in terms even the most traditional family members couldn't misunderstand. Leo was his acknowledged grandson, Amara was under his protection, and anyone who made them uncomfortable would answer to him personally. It hadn't made Madame Kang warm toward them. She maintained her icy distance, appearing at mandatory family functions with perfect courtesy but no actual warmth. But it had neutered her ability to actively interfere. "How is she?" Amara asked, because even now part of her needed to know what threats might be brewing. "Angry," Mireille said bluntly, "but also diminished. Father's been handling more of the business decisions directly. Appa's been consolidating power. She's still influential, but she's not the final word anymore." She bounced Leo on her hip. "Which is honestly better for everyone," Mireille continued. Mother's brilliant at business, but she was terrible at remembering that family is about more than spreadsheets and stock prices. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Leo point out everything that caught his attention. A boat on the river, a bicycle bell, a butterfly that might have been imaginary. "How are things with you and Appa?" Mireille asked, casual but clearly fishing. Amara felt heat creep into her cheeks. "Fine. Good. We're figuring it out." "Figuring it out," Mireille repeated with a knowing smile. "Is that why he's been leaving work at 5 p.m. sharp every day? Why he actually takes weekends off now? Because you're figuring it out? He wants to spend time with Leo," Amara said, which was true, but not the complete truth. Minjun had been patient, almost painfully so. He'd given her space and time and every assurance that he wasn't pressuring her for anything beyond co-parenting. They lived in the same penthouse but maintained separate bedrooms. He came home every evening and helped with Leo's dinner and bath time. They watched children's shows together and discussed daycare options and navigated parenting disagreements like a team. And slowly, carefully, they'd been rebuilding something that looked less like their old relationship and more like something new. Stronger because it had been tested, more honest because it had been broken. There had been a kiss. 3 weeks ago, after Leo's birthday party, Minjun had helped her clean up the chaos of wrapping paper and cake crumbs, and when they'd collapsed on the couch in exhaustion, she'd leaned into him without thinking. He'd looked at her with a question in his eyes, and she'd answered by closing the distance. It had been soft, tentative, tasting of vanilla frosting and possibility. They hadn't talked about it afterward. Not yet. Both of them still too cautious to name what was growing between them. But something had shifted. The way he looked at her now held heat instead of just hope. The way she allowed herself to touch him. A hand on his arm, fingers brushing when they passed Leo between them, spoke of trust rebuilding itself one small gesture at a time. "He loves you," Mireille said, breaking into her thoughts. "In case you were wondering." "I know," Amara said quietly. "And you love him," Mireille continued. "Even though you're still scared it'll all fall apart again." Amara's breath caught. It's okay to be scared," Mireille said gently. "What Mother did to you was traumatic. It makes sense that you'd have trouble trusting that this is real, that it won't be taken away again." She shifted, Leo to her other hip. "But here's what I know about my brother," Mireille said. "When he makes up his mind about something, he's immovable. And he made up his mind about you a long time ago. Everything that happened just made him more certain, not less." "How do you know?" Amara asked. Mireille smiled. "Because he kept a dress in a box for 2 years. Because he spent 3 days searching every market in Itaewon. Because he stood up to Mother, which none of us had ever seen him do before. Because he restructured his entire life around being Leo's father and whatever you're willing to let him be." She handed Leo back to Amara, who settled him into the stroller. "Stop waiting for the other shoe to drop," Mireille advised. "Sometimes good things stay good. Sometimes people mean what they say. Sometimes love is enough. Not on its own, but with work and honesty and showing up every day even when it's hard." She checked her phone. "I have to run. Actual scheduling conflict now. Not avoidance. But think about what I said. And also," she grinned mischievously, "Father's birthday dinner is next week. He's been not so subtly hinting that he'd like to see you and Appa arrive together. As a couple. Officially." "Mireille, just think about it," she called over her shoulder, already jogging away. "The old man deserves to see his family happy before he's too senile to remember it." Amara watched her go, then looked down at Leo, who had found a stick and was examining it like it held the secrets of the universe. As a couple. Officially. The thought made her stomach flutter with nervousness and something that felt dangerously close to hope. That evening, Minjun came home at 5:30, early by CEO standards, late by parent standards. He found Amara in the kitchen, attempting to make japchae from scratch, because Leo had decided it was his new favorite food, and she refused to order takeout for the 5th time in a week. "You're strangling the noodles," Minjun said, coming up behind her to look over her shoulder at the tangled mess in the pan. "I'm encouraging them," Amara retorted, but she was smiling. "Here," he said, gently taking the spatula from her hands. "You have to lift and fold, not stir. Like this." He demonstrated, his movements practiced and confident. Amara watched his hands, executive hands that signed billion-1 contracts, but also father hands that tied tiny shoes and wiped runny noses, partner hands that touched her with a gentleness that still surprised her. "When did you learn to cook?" she asked. "After you left," Minjun said, not looking up from the pan. "I couldn't stand eating alone in restaurants anymore. Everything tasted wrong. So I learned to cook the things you used to make. It didn't bring you back, but it made my apartment smell like you'd been there." The honesty in his voice, raw and unguarded, made Amara's throat tight. "Minjun," she started, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I'm not telling you to pressure you. I'm telling you because I'm done hiding how I feel. I wasted 2 years believing lies. I'm not wasting any more time." He plated the japchae with the precision of someone who'd practiced, then turned to face her. "I love you," he said simply. "I loved you 2 years ago when I was too stupid and trusting to fight for you. I loved you when I thought you'd betrayed me. I loved you when I found you again. And I love you now, watching you learn to cook Korean food for our son, standing in my kitchen like you were always meant to be here." He set the plate down on the counter. "I know you're still scared," he continued. "I know it'll take more than 6 months to undo the damage my family caused, but I need you to know I'm not going anywhere. Whether it takes 6 more months or 6 years or the rest of our lives, I'm here. I'm choosing you. Every single day, I'm choosing you." Amara felt tears prick her eyes, happy ones. This time, cleansing ones. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared that this is too good, that something will happen to take it away, that your mother will find a new weapon or the media will turn on us or maybe," Minjun interrupted gently, "nothing bad happens. Maybe we just get to be happy. Maybe that's allowed." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I can't promise you that nothing will ever go wrong," he said. "Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Amara. You haven't been alone since the night I found you. You're just finally letting yourself believe it." He was right. That was the terrifying part. He was absolutely right. She'd spent so long in survival mode, anticipating threats and planning escape routes, that she'd forgotten how to just be. How to accept good things without waiting for them to curdle. How to trust that safety could be real. "Okay," she said, quietly. Minjun's eyebrows rose. "Okay?" "Okay, I love you too," Amara clarified, and felt something huge and heavy lift off her chest as she said it out loud. "I never stopped, even when I tried to. Even when I told myself you were the enemy. I love you, and I'm tired of being scared of it." The smile that broke across Minjun's face was incandescent. "Say it again," he demanded, pulling her closer. "I love you," Amara said, laughing now, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I love you, you ridiculous, patient, japchae cooking CEO. Fiancé," Minjun corrected, and before she could process the word, he was kissing her. It wasn't tentative this time. It was certain, claiming, full of 2 years of longing and 6 months of rebuilding and a future that suddenly looked possible. She kissed him back with everything she'd been holding in, fear and hope and anger and forgiveness, all tangled together into something that tasted like coming home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Minjun pressed his forehead to hers. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "For real this time. Not as strategy or protection or anything except that I want to spend the rest of my life with you and our son, and whatever other children we might have if you want them." "You're supposed to have a ring," Amara pointed out, but she was grinning. "I have 17 rings," Minjun admitted. "I've been carrying one in my pocket every day for 3 months, waiting for the right moment. But they're all in my office safe because I was too nervous to actually propose. I can go get one right now if—" "Yes," Amara interrupted. "Yes, I'll marry you. Ring later. Kiss now." So he kissed her again, and this time when Leo toddled into the kitchen demanding, "Japchae, Mama, now!" They were laughing, tangled together in front of the cooling dinner, finally allowing themselves to believe in happy endings. Because sometimes, after the storm and the lies and the fear, love did win. Not easily, not without scars, not without work and patience and showing up every single day. But it won. And standing in that kitchen, former CEO, former runaway nanny, current parents, future spouses, they had won too. If you made it all the way here, you already know this wasn't just a baby mama drama. This was a war between love and legacy, and for once, love actually got to win. But don't get too comfortable. Madam Kang didn't disappear. The board still remembers that mixed-race heir, and every chaebol in Seoul is watching to see if this family cracks. If you want to see what happens when Amara has to walk into those charity galas on Minjun's arm, when Leo starts school with the Kang name, and when Madam Kang finally decides whether she'll play nice or burn it all down, make sure you're subscribed with the bell on. The next episode in this Afro-Korean saga is already waiting on the channel. Go watch it right after this. And before you click away, tell me in the comments. After everything you've seen, do you believe this happy ending is going to last? Type forever if you think Amara and Minjun are endgame, or storm if you feel another disaster coming.